It's hard to believe, but when this little boy grew up, he gathered tens of thousands of followers from many countries and founded the most dangerous cult that history has ever seen. The Aum Shinrikyo sect was much more than a group of followers who were captivated by a mysterious blind leader. Shoko Asahara, along with his disciples consisting of the country's brightest minds, committed the largest mass murder in Japan's modern history. Now we are delving into the depths of this Japanese cult, which is extremely strange and pushes the limits of our imagination. Shoko Asahara was born in 1955 on the southern Japanese island of Kyushu, the son of a mat weaver. His real name was Chizuo Matsumoto. He was completely blind in one eye and had very poor vision in the other. So when he was very young, his parents sent him to a boarding school for visually impaired children. Over time, this boy with limited vision became a bully who dominated and defrauded his classmates. He became both feared and respected. Asahara wanted to go to medical school, but he failed his exams and never went to university. Instead, he focused on acupuncture and yoga. Both are common careers for the blind in Japan. In 1978, he met and married college student Tomoko Ishii. During these years, he discovered the writings of Nostradamus, a 16th century French physician and seer who wrote extensively about the end of the world. This led to his obsession with the idea of the apocalypse. In 1984, Asahara opened a one-room yoga school. Although few people showed interest in the classes at first, the community grew rapidly as more people sought a path. Growth was accelerated by Asahara being a charismatic blind man who exuded an aura of divinity and a caring father figure. He spread the idea to his students that a nuclear war would soon end the world and that only the chosen would survive. In search of enlightenment, Asahara embarked on a journey to the Himalayas a few years later. He stayed with monks there for a while to study Hinduism and Buddhism and practiced various meditations. He posed for photos with senior Tibetan monks, including the Dalai Lama. When he returned to his country, he used these photographs to portray himself as an internationally respected religious figure, and he was extremely successful at it. Thinking that he had now become a guru, he decided to create a religion that was a combination of his own prophecies. For this reason, he blended Buddhism, one of the world religions, with Hindu gods. He added the physical aspect of yoga and took the concept of Armageddon from Christianity. Armageddon is the name of the great apocalyptic war that is said to happen when the world ends. Thus, in 1987, Asahara founded the Aum Shinrikyo sect, which means supreme truth, with a handful of his disciples. He later changed his name from Chizuo Matsumoto to Shoko Asahara. As time went by, Asahara's ideas became more and more daring. He gave sermons declaring that he had been chosen to raise an army to start the end of the world as soon as possible. He said that he was the reincarnation of Christ and the chosen one after Buddha. He then claimed that only he and his followers would survive the apocalypse and rule the new world. He then began to refer to himself as the Holy Pope, the savior of the country, and the Messiah of Tokyo. Asahara was very active in promoting his sect to the people. Knowing the importance of a strong team, his target audience was well-educated but lonely young people who were disappointed in their lives. The system in Japan was creating a generation of highly educated people who lacked basic social skills and understood very little of the outside world. Asahara found their weak spot and used all the resources he had to influence them. He brought his message to the country's young people who felt lost and alienated through magazines, videos, and books. Then he gave speeches at the best universities in the country and promised them a more meaningful life. He even claimed to have gained telepathy and levitation powers and offered to teach them these secret skills. In this way, thousands of people, almost all in their 20s, took refuge in Asahara. Some dropped out of the best schools to join the cult. Others left behind careers at top companies, families, friends, and bright futures. The high-tech kids of Japan were fascinated by his warnings of an apocalyptic future and his esoteric spiritualism. In their eyes, Asahara was now more like a supreme god than a human being. In some photographs, Asahara was shown levitating. This was one of his alleged powers. Another power was his ability to read people's minds. Since the bathwater he washed in touched his body, drinking that water was considered sacred. The same went for his blood. Shortly after, he opened a headquarters building at the foot of Mount Fuji with hundreds of people he gathered, and spiritual training camps began to be held here. The training included hours of meditation, little sleep, fasting, and electroshock therapy. They were also subjected to extreme physical tests, such as hanging upside down for long periods, immersing themselves in near boiling water, and being buried in a small box for days. During this training, members were given hallucinogenic drugs without their knowledge and were asked to give up everything from their old lives and hand over all their assets and money to the cult. In exchange for this money, Asahara would cleanse all their sins and grant them superhuman powers. The disciples had to work hard to get closer to him, but some of them could not stand this brutal training and died. Later, their bodies were burned and their ashes were thrown into the lake. Some of them wanted to tell the police about the deaths they witnessed and tried to leave the group, but they were also killed without mercy and their remains were destroyed. As you can see, anyone who opposed them was seen as an enemy of the truth, and thus the murders were legitimized. His ego became more and more inflated as people worshipped him as if he were a god. At the same time, he started to become more dangerous and aggressive. As a result, by his order, some of the highly educated people in the sect would produce weapons of mass intimidation, and some would conduct human experiments that were as good as horror movies. There was a very important name for the sect among these people: astrophysicist Hideo Murai. When Murai read one of Asahara's books, he was impressed by the subjects of levitation and telepathy, and he lost interest in his career and joined the cult. In time, he would become the cult's chief scientist and engineer of the apocalypse. Asahara wanted to use his high-tech knowledge. One of these was the electron caps that were supposed to transmit his brainwaves directly to his followers' brains. It was thought that these caps would make brainwashing and control more possible, but those who used them became dizzy and lost their memories. Thanks to Murai's scientific abilities, Asahara began to dream bigger. Fantastic weapons that would accelerate the end of the world, lasers, chemical and biological agents, new generation nuclear bombs. This land would be devastated like never before. Even if the leaders of the cult do all kinds of terrible and criminal things, they try to look good to the public. Half-blind, messy-haired, and bearded Asahara also gave regular interviews to yoga and meditation magazines to become more well-known. They even produced various cartoons to attract attention. But all this revealed those who disliked him, as well as those who loved him. Tsutsumi Sakamoto is a lawyer who works with the worried families of the cult members and files a lawsuit against the cult. But before the case could go to court, he, his wife, and his child were killed by members of the cult one night by injecting them with a lethal dose of potassium chloride. Then their lifeless bodies were put in barrels and buried in different forest areas of the country. In this case, that would be solved years later. The person who gave the order to kill was, of course, Asahara. Sect leaders are addicted to power and never get enough. That's why they often want to get involved in politics and control the entire population. 18 months before the 1990 national elections, Asahara and the 24 cult members he led ran as candidates for the Japanese parliament. Even though he had no political experience, everyone knew him. They even ran an election campaign where they sang and danced, but they couldn't win a single seat in the parliament. This made Asahara very angry, as he could not bear losing, and he decided to attack the people in a harsher and more hostile way. Work began on weapons production and supply. To do this, they came together with Japan's ruthless criminal organization Yakuza, former soldiers from the Japanese army, and Russian KGB agents. Asahara even went to Moscow for military training and nuclear bomb studies. He attracted around 30,000 members, including high-ranking officials from the Russian government. These new people gave the cult access to more weapons. Japanese cult members were even allowed to train with Russian paratroopers, learn how to use weapons and drive tanks, and then purchased a plane from the Russian government for $1 million to use for training. Aum Shinrikyo gathered nearly 50,000 members from Japan, America, Germany, Australia, and Russia. It had become one of the richest, most sophisticated, and most murderous religious cults in the world. The Japanese government had no knowledge of this for years. One reason for this was that they were more comfortable operating under the guise of religion. The other reason was probably that members of the Japanese police department, nearly 40 active members of the self-defense forces, and dozens of soldiers had joined the cult's army. Up to 40 bureaucrats in the country's top ministries, as well as tax collectors and judges, were among Asahara's disciples. As you can see, they had managed to infiltrate every corner of Japan. Everyone he had recruited was there for a purpose. They were all cogs in a wheel that would change the political course of the world. When there was no significant progress as a result of the exchanges with the Russians, they decided to produce biological weapons that would kill large numbers of people at the same time. State-of-the-art laboratories produced the viruses that cause anthrax, Q fever, and botulism. After several failed anthrax attacks, chemist Masami Tsuchiya became Asahara's rising star by creating the perfect homemade sarin nerve gas. First invented by the Nazis as a weapon of mass murder, sarin gas is a substance that causes instant death by locking down the muscles involved in breathing. To produce sarin gas, which is 10 times more lethal than cyanide, barrels of toxic chemicals were collected and experiments began at a huge facility they purchased in Western Australia. They then tested their deadly weapon on sheep, killing dozens of them, but the Australian authorities did not treat them as kindly as the Japanese authorities did. Several members were arrested at the airport for carrying illegal substances, so the team returned to Japan and bought a large building. Neighbors witnessed the group bringing in 55-gallon metal drums and various equipment. Although no one knew exactly what they were doing was successfully producing a weapon of mass destruction. Equipped with superpowers and weapons of mass destruction in their possession, the cult now had only one thing missing: a state. In 1994, Asahara ordered a major restructuring and established a shadow government. He even drafted a constitution that spelled out the structure of the new nation and the duties of the people. Now they could begin to take over the Japanese government. The night of June 27, 1994, Matsumoto City. Sarin gas was released from a truck near the homes of judges overseeing a real estate dispute that was expected to be decided against the cult. In this attack on civilians, 8 people died and more than 500 people were injured. For the group that had first tested sarin gas, the 8 deaths proved that they were ready for bigger and better targets. The death toll was lower than expected, but it was only the beginning. Now they had to launch a much larger attack, but they didn't know when. The answer came in the form of an earthquake. The earthquake in Kobe on January 17, 1995 was Japan's worst disaster since World War II. More than 6,000 people lost their lives. For Asahara, this destruction was clear evidence of impending doom. During this period, it was rumored that the police were raiding sex centers, and Aum Shinrikyo was at the top of the list. They decided to take action immediately and made a plan. They would stage a coup to paralyze the country a second time and start the cult's world domination. The target was the capital, Tokyo. March 20th, 1995. It was around 7:45 a.m. on a typical Monday morning. People, most of whom were on their way to work, got on the subway, unaware of what would happen to them shortly. 5 members of the assassination team, who especially chose these busy hours, mingled with the crowd. They boarded 5 trains at different ends of the vast subway network. Each of them wore a surgical mask and carried liquid sarin packets wrapped in newspaper in plastic bags of approximately 1 liter. They knew that these 5 trains would converge at the Japanese Parliament building, which governs 125 million people. A few stops before the convergence point, they placed their lethal packets on the floor of the cars and poked holes with umbrellas. When the doors opened, each of them dove into the crowd and ran to the area where the getaway cars were waiting. Meanwhile, a total of 11 bags of sarin gas on the trains were rapidly moving towards the city center, along with thousands of unlucky passengers. As the invisible gas spread, the passengers began to choke and groan with nausea. Some passengers collapsed to the ground, their bodies shaking violently as foam poured from their mouths. As the train stopped, evacuation announcements were made at the stations as passengers staggered towards the exit with limited vision and dizziness. The sidewalks and roads were full of injured people. As the trains reached their destinations, everything turned into chaos, and the police and ambulances could not keep up with them all. Blinded and dazed victims tried to make their way to nearby hospitals on their own. Doctors noticed that the patients were experiencing the same symptoms as the attack nearly a year earlier. They administered atropine, an antidote to sarin, but it was too late for some. 14 people died as a result of the attack. More than 6,000 people suffered injuries that left them blind and paralyzed. Fear gripped the nation, and Japan's image as one of the safest countries in the world was shattered. Citizens were afraid to board trains, and garbage bins were removed from stations. Soon, rumors began to circulate that the Aum Shinrikyo cult was behind the attack, and 2 days after the attack, police raided the sect's headquarters at the foot of Mount Fuji. They found a massive sarin production facility, a stockpile of sarin enough to kill 4 to 10 million people, a Russian military helicopter, explosives, LSD and meth labs, millions of dollars in cash, and dozens of people in solitary confinement. But Asahara was nowhere to be found. Ironically, a week after the attack, the cult's chief scientist, Hideo Murai, was stabbed in the stomach by a Korean Yakuza member while giving a speech in front of dozens of news cameras outside the cult's headquarters. He died hours later. Finally, on May 16, Asahara was found meditating, hidden in a box-like high space inside the wall of a cult building. Watched on television by millions, Japanese police used a giant saw to cut holes in the steel walls outside his small hiding place. Asahara, who was almost supernaturally calm as the arrest warrant was read, said only one thing as he was led away: "I understand." He was saddened by the low death toll. Asahara's trial was described as the trial of the century in Japan and lasted 7 years. About 200 of his followers were convicted of various crimes. He and 12 others involved in the murders were sentenced to death. After decades of appeals, they were all hanged in 2018. It's ironic that a cult leader who had the ability to levitate should die by hanging. Thus, the cult's efforts to create a new world came to an end. After all of this, the Japanese government banned the cult's activities and labeled them a terrorist group. Aum Shinrikyo was the first and only terrorist group to successfully use a weapon of mass destruction, and this action was carried out by a Buddhist religious group that embraced the principle of nonviolence. We learned what happens when you combine a crazy, intelligent, and ruthless leader with a group of psychopathic, brilliant scientists who are determined to kill indiscriminately. The story of Aum Shinrikyo really feels like it came out of the world of science fiction novels and thrillers. But unfortunately, it's all true, and the scary thing is, it won't be the last. Shoko Asahara was one of the most extraordinary personalities to have walked this earth. What do you think makes people, especially young people, who describe him as God, do everything he says unconditionally, and continue to believe in him even after his death, fall into such sects? How can we prevent this? Don't forget to write your thoughts in the comments. Goodbye.